everyone. Thank you for coming to our Brown Bag Lecture Series here at the Kearney Public Library. I'm Dr. Nathan Ty. I'm the Master of Ceremonies for our long-running series, which we hold in collaboration with the library, who are, as always, a wonderful partner and a treasure of the cultural scene here in central Nebraska. So we always want to thank the public library for everything that they do. I just want to have kind of a couple of general announcements. This is the last Brown Bag for this year. We're not going to hold one in December, but we will be starting again in February. So they're flyers for the February talk. We do have other history department events that are happening. This Sunday at 7 p.m. we are co-sponsoring a free documentary screening on David Kaufman, the Grand Island businessman, also Kearney businessman, as many of you will remember the Kaufman department store downtown, and the families that he saved and rescued from the Holocaust. And so that will be at 7 p.m. at the World Theater. There will be a short presentation, conversation at 6:30 with Dr. Torsten Homburger from the History Department, as well as Michelle Setlick, the Vice President of the Hall County Historical Society, at 6:30. Again, that is a free screening at the World Theater. There's more details online as well about that. Then our next Brown Bag lecture won't be until February 12th. Which will be on Albert Frederick Lewis, who's a pioneering lacrosse player who's buried in our cemetery here, and I will be doing that talk. One of the things that is wonderful about our work in the history department is the support of our students, our young researchers, our young historians, our young educators. And so if you don't know, today is the beginning of One Day for UNK, the annual kind of fundraising drive for the university. So if you haven't looked, and if you'd be willing and generous to support our students, the history department is directing our funds to our student organization and other student-focused efforts within the department. And so there's a QR code in the back that'll take you for all of that information. But I want to get to our speaker today, our Women New to Politics. And our speaker is the chair of the history department, Dr. Linda Van Ingen, who's a professor at UNK. Her expertise is in 20th century U.S. social and political history, including women's history, the civil rights movement, and immigration. She's the author of the book Gendered Politics, Campaign Strategies of California Women Candidates, 1912 to 1970. She grew up overseas in a number of countries, and she always has very fascinating stories about her time. And then she came back to Iowa, where she finished high school and earned her degree at the University of Iowa. After working for 8 years in nonprofit political organizations, she went back to school and earned her PhD in history from the University of California, Riverside, and then joined the UNK faculty in 2001, where she is now a full professor and chair. So without further ado, Dr. Van Ingen.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you all for coming. And just a quick mic check again. You guys can hear me okay? I have the portable microphone. I can walk around, but let me know if you can't hear me. So yeah, I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to see you all here at this talk about our Women New to Politics, because we're just coming out of the presidential election season, as you all know, and we might be kind of exhausted from it all. But we'll wrap up with a look at Nebraska women in politics today. And my question, are women new to politics? I'm going to give you the answer right away. The answer is no, they're not new. I have so much material on Nebraska women in politics that I'm hoping to get it, confined to this short time space that we have today. And if I run long, you're just going to have to raise your hand and shut me down so that we can have some questions and discussion at the end. So in putting this together, because I do teach women's history and women in political history, I usually do it on a national level or do state-by-state comparisons and such. But it was fun and interesting to focus specifically on Nebraska for today and bring in all my disparate pieces and put them into one slideshow. The slideshow being PowerPoint, this is how we teach nowadays. And as I was mentioning to Connie earlier, this is an AI-generated slide, this particular one. So I put in the information and it popped up, and this is new, like within the last month. Popped up and said, we have a better design for you. I said, oh, actually that looks pretty good, I'll take it. But you'll see my next slide is my own and not as nicely designed. So as we go through, you can decide whether these are AI-generated visuals or my own. So this one is my own, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at women, Nebraska women in politics, and we're going to start from the recent past, yesterday, and move into the distant past and see how far we can go to get a sense of Nebraska women's history in Nebraska's women's political history in this state. So of course we know Deb Fisher. We're going to start with her. She's the most recently elected, just re-elected to her third term. We all feel like we know her, but I found it interesting to learn a little bit more about her. She has a strong family background in public education. Her mom taught elementary school, and her father, was director of roads for the state of Nebraska under 2 governors. So she has a good connection to a lot of public works history. She previously served in the Unicam from 2005 to 2013, and also, raised in Lincoln. She met her husband while she was in college, and then moved out to Valentine where they have a cattle ranch. And then she went back to school to finish her undergraduate degree at Lincoln in 1987. So that's actually a pretty typical story for a lot of women coming from that generation. The 60s and 70s, might have started college and finished up later, and she's one of them. I also found it interesting to learn that she was a commissioner on the CCPE. Those of us who are affiliated with the University of Nebraska know the CCPE is a very important commission appointed by the governor, and they oversee a lot of the university systems in the state of Nebraska. And they've been involved in a lot of the questions about benchmarks and budgets and things like that in recent times. So she was on that commission a few years ago, quite a few years ago. So we know Deb Fisher, and so U.S. Senator, Nebraska's first U.S. Senator, but actually not. This gets to another point I want to make in my presentation here, is that this issue about women's firsts, who's first? Who was elected first? Who's in this office first? She was the first. She was the first. It's all over the place in women's history about women in politics, and it gets to a point where we have to ask, how useful is it to know if a woman was first in something? So with Deb Fisher, she was the first woman elected from Nebraska to the U.S. Senate for a full term. So she's got that claim. But actually, there were other women in the Senate before her from Nebraska. So this woman, Eva Boring, she was appointed to serve as a senator for just a few days, 7 months, until a special election. And she was replacing, Dwight Griswold, some of you might know the name. He was the governor of Nebraska, had also served in the state legislature, became governor, and then went to the U.S. Senate. And within the first few years in the U.S. Senate, he died. So this is sort of a lot of an avenue that a lot of women took to get into political office. So she was appointed, and she, in her later life, when she was widowed, in her will, she donated her and her husband's ranch in Cherry County to the NGPC, the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, and that's now Boring Ranch State Historical Park. So when you go there, you find that they make a claim that she was the first woman in the Senate from Nebraska. Okay, first woman appointed, not elected, not a full term, right? All these qualifiers and what's first. Hazel Abels also comes around the same time. She finishes this term that Boring started, and until then a man is elected a little bit later. So she only serves for 2 months in the Senate, and she actually ran for governor in 1960. Both women are very involved in their political parties, in the Republican Party, which is partly why they get this opportunity to be appointed. So Deb Fisher is not first, but first elected. She's certainly not the first nationwide to go into the Senate. The first woman nationwide was appointed, also not elected, 87-year-old Rebecca Felton. She was appointed for 24 hours. So do we even count that? Why should we even count that? She's not really a senator. But she gets that title of being the first appointed, and she was very much a suffragist leader in the cause for women's right to vote, but she was also pretty racist, and is one of the, apparently one of the last people in the Senate to have been a slaveholder. So she was that old, and I'm not sure that's a claim, so she's first for 24 hours. So we really need to know everything about her, Hattie Caraway from Arkansas also appointed to replace her husband who passed away while he was in office. And that's often, as I said, the pathway for women to get into office. But Deb Fisher from Nebraska was elected for a full term, but that's pretty recent times. And I just can't go beyond the women in the U.S. Senate without commenting on a significant woman in the Senate elected in 1949 from the state of Maine, Margaret Chase Smith. So she ended up serving 24 years in the U.S. Senate. She's significant in history, still not because she was first or almost first or qualified first, but because when she was in the Senate, she spoke up and gave a speech called the Declaration of Conscience, which criticized the Red Scare leadership of Joseph McCarthy, who had amassed so much power that people around him were afraid to disagree with him in the Senate, because he would paint them as communists and ruin their careers, you know. So she was brave enough to speak up and say, you know, where's your sense of decency, is what she and others were starting to say about Joseph McCarthy. He was a senator from Wisconsin, if you don't know his history, but to her credit, right? She spoke up at the Senate. So one more thing about women in the Senate. We have the Year of the Women in 1992, and again, when this came out in 1992, and newspapers are saying, oh, you know, Year of the Women, Year of the Women. A lot of women political historians are rolling our eyes and go, oh, another Year of the Woman, you know, oh, another woman's first. So what we found in 1992, though, is that there was a surge of women not only running for the Senate, but winning across the country. And this surge meant that we had the election of 5 new women here into the Senate to join the 2 that were there, so we had more women in the Senate than ever before in 1992. So that's the Year of the Women, and the reason there was a surge is this was the time, 1991, with the Clarence Thomas hearings for the Supreme Court appointment. And Joe Biden was chair of the Judiciary, U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, and there was lots of controversy as to how that was handled. And people looked at the Judiciary Committee and said, well, where are the women on the committee? Why are there no women senators on the Judiciary Committee? And so this prompted more women to run for office and maybe get on some of these committees in the U.S. Senate. So that's our look at the Senate. And you'll see I've got my slides color-coded so we can see we're making a shift. You know? But talking a lot about women's first, we have to go to the governor of Nebraska, Kay Orr. She was the first woman elected governor in the state in 1986, and she's also the first Republican woman elected governor in the country at that time. She's from Lincoln, elected 1986. She served 1 term following Bob Kerrey, narrowly lost her re-election. She came in with some good experience as a Nebraska state treasurer in 1981, and having been in Iowa, you know, Burlington was in our athletic conference. I thought, oh, she's from, maybe she was on swim team when I was on swim team. So Kay Orr is significant for her leadership as governor of Nebraska. And she's also significant, another first here, a lot of emphasis on women's first, because she's the first to run against another woman for the governorship. And this was unusual nationally. She ran against Helen Gonzalez, who was the mayor of Lincoln, and Helen was from Minneapolis, Greek immigrant parents. But having the 2 women, you know, debate and meet each other as opponents, it was a certainty that a woman was going to be governor of Nebraska. We just didn't know which one. And this was significant for the time. Another woman's first. But she was not the first to run for governor in Nebraska. We've got Maud Nuquist of Osceola. She ran for governor in 1934. And her granddaughter actually wrote an article documenting this history because she had a lot of the artifacts in her family that wasn't in the public domain, and so we learned more about Maud. And so here she is here. There's one of her advertisements to run for governor. Yours for political house clean. The sweep clean government. And this is the 1930s, and actually a lot of women ran for office in the 1930s, and this was often their campaign slogan, that they're going to sweep clean government, end corruption in government, you know, clean up politics. I had one woman in California when I was doing my research there. Her campaign letterhead was her standing with a broomstick. And I thought, well, that's going to get her elected. Sweep out politics. But one thing I want to point out here is that Maud was a president of the General Federation of Women's Clubs. And this was another avenue to leadership, but you didn't necessarily win political office. A lot of women were involved in the women's clubs movements and the reform movements, and they got a lot of good experience, but they didn't necessarily get elected to office. Making that shift to, to gendered politics where men and women are competing was difficult. Okay, so nationally, who's the first woman governor? We go back to the 20s. Wyoming was the first state to grant women the vote. And they also run women pretty early, and they get the first woman governor. This is Nellie Taylor Ross, and she comes in because her husband had been governor and he died in office. She's appointed and she runs on her own term. So that's pretty common. And then over here, similar but a little bit different, Miriam Ma Ferguson. Her husband was also governor, but he was impeached. So he didn't die in office, but he was impeached, and you can just see them crafting a plan to keep up his administration. They go, put your wife in. And so she's appointed and finishes up his term, and then she actually runs on her own merits a little later, non-consecutive term. She was called Ma Ferguson. This is in Texas. Her husband as governor was called Pa Ferguson. Family affair for these. So we've had, women governors ever since, and today we've got 40 to date. Totally over history, we've had 49 women serve as governors in 32 states. I think it's worth pointing out that California has not had a woman governor yet. And I was, depending on the election, I was going to say, but they put forward the first woman president, but they didn't. But they put forward the second major party woman candidate. Kamala Harris was from California. But yeah, getting elected into the executive branch is no easy task. The representative branch, the U.S. Senate, the House, the state legislature, is designed for representation. The executive branch comes with different expectations, and it's been very difficult for women to make that leap into that level of leadership, the executive branch. But Kayor did, to her credit. Here's a picture of Kayor. When she was elected and before she was inaugurated, she went to the National Governors Association. They have these gatherings. I think one of our governors recently was president of that association a few terms ago. But the president at this time, when she's elected, is this guy, Bill Clinton. We didn't know, she didn't know he was going to be a president. But he's moderating the question and answer session apparently with journalists. And they were asking her if she was going to raise taxes in Nebraska, because when she became governor, there was a budget shortfall. And of course, this is a story that repeats itself often. They kept asking her a question about whether she's going to raise taxes, and so Bill Clinton kept, he interrupted and said, "That's enough. You promised you're only going to ask her one question. You've asked her 5." And so he lightened up the mood, and everybody laughed apparently. But I thought I would share that because I thought, hey, who knew the future in 1986 with this leadership there? So how did women win the governorship or any position in office? It helps to have a connection to a man in the party of power. And so certainly if you're a widow and your husband was in office, you're appointed to his position, that's an in, right? You've got all the credibility coming from the deceased husband. But also if you get an endorsement from a sitting president, that really helps, but it's not a guarantee. But Kayor, she obviously benefited from Reagan's endorsement in 1986, and she won her term, but she was not so lucky when she got Bush to come and support her for her reelection. But then he lost his own reelection a couple years later. But then also Helen Busalis, she got the endorsement from Bob Kerrey, who was the outgoing governor, and that didn't help her. Reagan trumped Kerry. So looking at the Congress then, moving on beyond the governorship, we have Nebraska women in Congress. Nebraska woman singular in Congress. When I moved here, and people knew I studied women in politics. Everybody has always asked me about Virginia Dodge Smith, and yeah, because she represented the 3rd district in the U.S. House of Representatives, and was elected first in 1974. So she's in office 1975. She certainly benefited from her connection to men in the party in power. So Gerald Ford endorsed her, and she says here, "Need your help." You know? This is a political ad in November 1st, right before the election. It says here, an extension of, so she's a Republican, right? These are Republicans. An extension of the present Democratic majority in Congress will prevent President Ford from returning the nation to a sensible economic program. His program will allow all of us to run our farms, ranches, jobs, and businesses in a predictable, stable economic atmosphere. So Virginia Smith and President Ford are friends, and in major matters they think alike. Don't give the Democrats a veto-proof Congress that will defeat Jerry Ford's recovery programs. Vote for Virginia Smith. So clearly an endorsement from Ford, President Ford, and not only that, but they're friends, right? So this was going to help her win, and she was able to secure her following and win more than once. I think she had 9 terms in the Congress. So she completed her last few terms in the 1980s, late 1980s, when Kay Orr was elected. And I just want to pause here and point out how significant the 1980s were in terms of women's political history, because we do see a shift in alignments in terms of political partisanship. So especially for women in politics. Smith, so we had a graduate student, Corlin Solwell? Yeah, Corlin Solwell. Yeah, she's not here? So she did her master's thesis in the 1990s on Virginia Smith. And one of the great opportunities she had, because she did it in the 1990s, was she was able to interview Smith and ask her some questions, and we learned there in this thesis that Virginia Smith supported the Equal Rights Amendment, which was a big political issue in the 1970s and 1980s. And why this is a transformative time for women in politics in the 1980s is because the Equal Rights Amendment becomes front and center an issue, and very typical for Republican women to support the ERA. So what is the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment? It basically was a proposal to amend the U.S. Constitution. It would have said, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex or gender, right? So like any amendment to the Constitution, it's really hard to amend the U.S. Constitution. You have to get 2/3 of Congress to support it, and then 3/4 of the states. So this amendment was first introduced in 1923 by Alice Paul, who was a big suffragist at the time. And in fact, she was not Republican herself, but a big progressive wing of the Republican Party was really in the leadership of the suffrage movement. And the Republican Party endorsed the ERA in 1940, and as I said, we needed 2/3 of the Congress to support it, to send it out to the states for a vote. And it finally passed Congress in 1972. It had been introduced and kicked out of committee for years, since the 1920s. But it finally passed Congress in 1972, and then it needed to go to the states for ratification. And we needed 3/4 of the states, and we got up to 38. In fact, we got 30 within the first year, and then 35. And then it stalls, and then Congress extended the deadline to 1982. So here I have a map of the ERA levels of support from around the state, the different states. And Nebraska's sitting here in the orange. We were the first, actually we were the second, to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. Hawaii was first. It was sort of a time zone issue. Nebraska actually wanted to be the first. So we were the first to ratify it through our unicam. But then there was a rollback. So a number of states ratified, that's the orange here. And the red, and then this yellow-orange is where something happened to stall the whole effort. And that takes us back to Nebraska here, because there was a brewing anti-ERA movement led by Phyllis Schlafly. You might know her name. So she founded the Eagle Forum and the anti-ERA movement, and very effectively won support against the Equal Rights Amendment, and went to a number of state legislatures and convinced them to either not support it, or here in Nebraska to roll it back. She met with our Senator Richard Proud in March 1973 and convinced him to introduce legislation to take back the vote that Nebraska had given for the Equal Rights Amendment. And he was effective. So I had a student a few years ago, she did her research on this, and she interviewed Richard Proud. He was living in Colorado now, and she asked him, do you have any regrets about thwarting the Equal Rights Amendment, rolling it back here in Nebraska? And he's like, no, it's one of his proud moments. The significance of it is not only that it rolled back the vote here in Nebraska, but other states followed suit. So you can see South Dakota, Idaho, and then these states over here, Kentucky and Tennessee, I guess that is, also rescinded their vote. So there's controversy now. Is the ERA amendment still viable? Is it out there? What is it? These dark purple states ratified the amendment recently. Virginia, like maybe 5 years ago, when they had a majority of support for that. But the legal actions are there. Like, was it legal for Nebraska to take back the vote when they actually said first they wanted it, and can you change your mind? How do you count that? So we're kind of left with a mess in terms of that Equal Rights Amendment. It stalled, and Congress, as I said, extended the deadline, but nothing happened once this rescission movement started. So just a quick look at Phyllis Schlafly. She did come to Nebraska, as I said, met with Richard Proud. So here's a picture in the rotunda of the state capitol building. And you can look, you can see the women protesting. It says here, don't draft our daughters, stop ERA. And this was a very effective piece of the anti-ERA movement, because there was uncertainty there as to what it actually meant. Does it mean unisex bathrooms? Does it mean women can't be supported by their husbands? Does it also mean women then are subject to the draft? Because this is the age of Vietnam. Now we're moving into an all-volunteer force by 1973. But it was controversial, and there were concerns. The irony is that women have continued to get a lot of equal rights anyway, by law. Women serve in combat now in the military forces. So a lot of what the ERA would have done has been accomplished, but nothing's guaranteed by the Constitution. It would just take an initiative in Congress to introduce a bill to roll back a lot of the rights that women had gained, and that would take a decision in Congress, and that would be it, signature from the president. So that's the ERA aspect, and certainly Nebraska's significance there. But it does produce, we can see a gender gap emerging in politics. And so about the ERA here, the Republican Party then in 1980 withdrew support for the Equal Rights Amendment, and it was no longer on the party platform. The other development that contributes to an emerging gender gap in politics, of course, is abortion, which continues to be a very contentious issue. But it was made legal by a Supreme Court decision in 1973. Prior to that, it was state by state. We had different rules. And even prior to that, it was never even on the books. Abortion was not legal or illegal until the 1890s. Prior to that, it wasn't even a legal question. So when it became a national law supported by the Supreme Court decision, it was made partisan when Bob Dole was running for re-election in 1974. You might know Bob Dole's name from our neighboring state of Kansas. But he was a senator, a long-time serving senator, but his first bid for re-election was very narrowly won, highly contested. He was running against Bill Roy. So this is Bill Roy, this is Bob Dole. And Bill Roy had been a doctor, medical doctor, and he had performed some abortions. And as soon as the Dole camp realized that, they used that against the doctor and discredited him. And he was trying to make a nuanced argument that he was against abortion, but for the law, you know, pro-choice, but personally against it. He gave horror stories as to why he had to perform some abortions because women had come into his office, his clinic, bleeding to death, those kinds of stories. Needless to say, he lost his bid to unseat Bob Doyle, but this was a, well, what is it? Can of worms or Pandora's box or a whole new other direction for political strategy to win political office. So the Republican Party is going to pick this up and run with it. Even Ronald Reagan, when he was governor of California, was pretty liberal on abortion. He signed into law some legislation. He signed into law a bill that would make abortion, make therapeutic abortions legal. And therapeutic abortions were you could go to a psychiatrist and get permission or whatever the prescription for a legal abortion because you would be unfit to become a mother at your tender age of 12 or 15 or 21, you know, whatever it is. So he did that as governor, but as this became more and more a partisan issue, of course, this was going to be a big platform piece on the Republican Party platform. So back to this issue of firsts. I have this all under Virginia Smith because she was an Equal Rights Amendment proponent. I don't know where she stood on the question of abortion. And in those days, it probably didn't come up until a little bit later as a political agenda item. But she was not the first, even though Virginia Smith was the first woman from Nebraska in Congress. The first one actually comes from Montana, and that's Jeanette Rankin, first nationally elected in 1917. So, you know, how many years later? Is that 50-some years later? Nebraska gets its first. But you might look at 1917 and go, you know, but wait, I thought women didn't get the vote till 1920. Did you think that? That's true. Women did not get the vote nationally until 1920 with an amendment to the Constitution, as we just learned are really hard to pass. It took 70 years to do it. But a lot of states, in their own state legislatures, in their own state constitutions, gave women the right to vote. And this map is very clear in showing that it's a lot of Western states that gave women the right to vote through their state constitution, waiting for the federal government to catch up. So one reason Western states were advanced in that regard is because they needed people to move into their states. I always make a joke about Wyoming being the first because where's Wyoming here? Because you need people to move into your state. So Wyoming as a territory gave women the vote, even. But why, you know, where's Nebraska in this? And it turns out Nebraska women were very involved in politics. So to my question, are women new in politics? Yes. There were a lot of suffrage movements in Nebraska trying to get the state to grant women the right to vote. Amelia Bloomer, she came over the border from Iowa and spoke to the Nebraska territorial legislature in 1856, advocating for the vote for women. We had the Women's Suffrage Association organized around the 1880s with big campaigns, and they were often defeated, more than one campaign. Big opponent to giving women the vote was the liquor interests, as they said. Certainly around Omaha area, big German breweries that were afraid if women got the vote, they would vote in prohibition. So prohibition actually is a big issue here. Not all states had to deal with that concern, but it certainly was a factor here. And so women, you know, took the gains where they could find them, and they got school suffrage. In 1883, you could vote for school board. And they got presidential suffrage in 1917, and that went to the courts. They were never actually allowed to vote. Some states gave this kind of partial vote to women. And you might be asking, well, that seems kind of a big deal, give women the right to vote for president. It was less controversial, less of a challenge to status quo politics to give women the vote for president, much more, what's the word? Controversial, politically dangerous to give women the right to vote on a state level, because that's where you have a lot of entrenched state politics and power politics at the state level. And so people didn't want to, risk giving women the vote and upsetting the power of politics at the state level. So some states gave women the partial vote. Illinois gave women the partial vote for the presidency before Nebraska did. As I said, Nebraska women never actually got to vote for anything until 1920 when the national amendment passed because of courts and lots of kind of complicated history here. But I found this political cartoon kind of fun because here's the suffrage movement. It says Nebraska women suffragists. And the court's now here saying, here, take this child, right? With good care, it will grow. So take what you can get, right? And she's pretty beat up, she's all scuffed up from the fight. So Nebraska women, I'm arguing, have been politically engaged for a long time. And Doris Stevens is a good example of a suffragist who went beyond the state level. She went to Washington, D.C. So here she is marching in D.C. with the suffragists. To her left, I guess it is Alice Paul, who was the one that really was significant in the suffrage movement early on and introduced the Equal Rights Amendment. But their protests in Washington, D.C. were radical, were controversial, they were considered militant. And so some of these women got arrested. So here's Doris Stevens in her prison garb. Some of these women went on hunger strikes to try to make the point. Doris Stevens was pardoned and was able to leave after 3 days. So I've been talking a lot about Nebraska women, but if we take an intersectional approach where you factor in race and class, you realize we've been talking a lot about white women, and probably privileged white women who can afford to campaign and spend time and resources to campaign and move politics in their direction. But when you do factor in race and ask the question about black women in office, it's a different story. They didn't have a lot of opportunities until really the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement. The first black women in the state legislatures before the Civil Rights Movement, again, are people who are appointed after their husbands died. And this woman from Pennsylvania was elected in 1939. But one big name woman on the congressional level who was the first black woman in Congress is Shirley Chisholm, and from New York State. And she also ran for president in 1974 on the Democratic Party, for the Democratic Party nomination. So she doesn't get the nomination, so she's not a major party candidate, but she has some really fun, interesting campaign footage of her efforts from the 1970s, when Nixon was also running. And who's this? Utah, first and only Republican black woman elected to the House in 2015, which is pretty recent. So we have a lot of firsts, and again, I'm asking the question, how significant is it to know who was first? It does help, though, to build a collective memory of women's engagement in politics. So in Nebraska, the first black women elected are elected to the state legislature, and not until, well, the first one's 1977, she's appointed, not elected, but then we've got Brenda Council and Tanya Cook elected in 2009, which relatively speaking is pretty recent, both from Omaha. Black men have been much more involved or successful in elective politics. The first African-American man elected to the House of Representatives, because remember we had two chambers. Early on was Dr. Ricketts in 1893, and we've had 15 African-Americans in the legislature pretty continuously, and we know, of course, Ernie Chambers has the record for the longest serving legislator in Nebraska. And he's represented North Omaha all these years, and in fact, most of the African-American representation has been from North Omaha. So this takes me to this question here of the state legislature. So we've looked at the U.S. Senate, we've looked at the House of Representatives, we looked at the governor, And we looked at African American women in various places here. But what about the state legislature here at home in Nebraska? And so here I have a picture of the Unicam in January 1947, and kind of looking for the women in the picture here. See me? A little bit of a clue, you have to look for the hats. See anyone? Anybody see me? I see one over here, there's a hat. And then there's clerical people somewhere up here, I think that's a woman. And then up in the balcony. So women relegated to the balcony many, many times in politics, right? So where are the women in the Nebraska state legislature? Ooh. Zippy.
Who was that on the floor?
Yeah, I don't know who that was. But she wasn't a legislator, she must have been an observer. That would be interesting research, trying to figure out who that person was. I don't have it. So who was the first woman elected to the state legislature? And the reports show that, newspapers show that it was Kathleen Foote from Axtell. She was elected in 1954, and this is one of her political ads here. So it says down here, this ad paid for by Kathleen Foote. And she was one of a flock of new senators. We know a little bit more about her. When she's interviewed, she says, "I'm not that type at all." What are they talking about? Is she a Nebraska Carry Nation, right? An anti-prohibitionist. She goes, "When I was campaigning, a lot of people were afraid that I might be one of those crusaders for women's rights," said Mrs. Frank Foote, 28. She's only 28 years old, from Minden, Axtell, Minden. On the contrary, she says, "I'll go into the legislature with an open mind. What's more," she says, "I hope that women will take a little more interest in politics in the future, but I think there always should be a majority of men." So walking that fine line between her own ambitions and what she wants to do, and then the reality of working with other legislators. She had 2 children at the time, 4 years old and 2.5 years old, and then she shared with and this is another ad, or another article, Axtell Farm Wife, and in this one they say that she was a graduate of Stanford University, so we need to find out a little bit more about her. But then she announced to the press that she is expecting a baby, her 3rd child, and due in spring, when the session opens in January, and so people were asking her about that. And she says, well, she's done her research, she's studied the attendance records of other legislators, and believes she will miss no more of the session than some of the others have in the past. She got national attention for this legislator must stop for baby. This is in the Miami Herald, 1954. And it just says here, Kathleen Foote, state senator-elect of Axtell, Nebraska, admits one thing will take precedence over her duties as lawmaker when the session meets in January. She's scheduled for a visit to the maternity ward. So is she a first in that regard? And of course the answer is no, because my own research on the women in California had the exact same thing. This woman, Wanda Sankery, ran for office in 1954. Few days after her election, she gives birth to her 1st child. And the newspapers are all over this. She's from San Diego, smiles happily in hospital bed yesterday at her 1st child, Timothy. Born Wednesday after final returns, showed his mother elected as assemblywoman for the 1st term. It's her new constituent, her 1st son. What's interesting about Wanda Sankery is she's from North Dakota, moved with her family to California, as a lot of people from the Great Plains did. Another woman in California who is one of the longest serving legislators there was from Nebraska. She's from North Nebraska, from a cattle ranch up there, was a telephone operator, moved to California and got involved in politics and elected up there. So we have connections all around. So who was the first governor? Who was first in the legislature in Nebraska? And we got Nell Krause from, is it Albion?
Albion.
again, appointed, replaced somebody, and we've got favorite, appointed, widowed. Only can find a picture of Nell. Not much more about them because they're appointed for a short time, but they get the credit of being the first women elected to the unicam, or appointed to the unicam, but not the first elected. Kathleen Foote's the first elected, right? You got to keep all that. But were they the first? So here's an interesting chart. This is Nebraska, the percentage of Nebraska women legislators. And we have this strange gap here of nobody in office, no women in office at the state level. And most states have it low like this, and then they all jump with the women's movement of the 60s and 70s. But no states, when I look through the charts, have this big of a gap. Some might have a little one because there's nobody in that year and then somebody comes in. So what's happening in Nebraska, where we have that gap of 20 years of no women representation, because it looks like we have women representation early on. So of course, what's the answer? What happened?
What years is it?
Oh, 38, 37, 38, and then Kathleen Foote in 54.
World War II.
That's true, World War II. A lot of women run for office during World War II, actually, nationally. Because the men are gone. Depression, 1930s. A lot of men and women run for office during the Great Depression nationally because that might be a job, Opposition from conservatives, the Ku Klux Klan maybe. No, it's not even that awful. It's the unicam, the shift from a bicam to a unicam. Voters approved the creation of a unicameral, single-chamber legislature. In 1934, it was going to become effective in 1937. And that meant far fewer seats when we made the shift from the bicam to the unicam. We would go from 130-some seats to what we have now, 49. And that's a really small number of representatives at the state level. We're the smallest state legislature in the country. So fewer opportunities to run and win office. So the years 1934-36 are kind of lame duck years. Because why would you run for the bicam house when we've already voted to dismantle it in a couple years? So we have a peak number of women running and getting elected in 1934, 35, 36 for those lame duck years. But even before that, we had women in the legislature, in the House branch of the bicameral. We're so used to unicam, but we had a bicameral from our founding as a state when we came out of territorial status, and had a two-chamber system, just like we're the only state that has one chamber. Other states have considered it, and they're like, no, we need, people want the representation. So you look at this picture of the bicameral in existence. This picture is from 1929 to 1931. And again, look for the hats. Do you see any? A lot more people in the legislature. You see one here. Actually, she does not have a hat on. And I think there's one over here. So this is a year where there's 2 women. And these 2 women include one of these 3 and a couple others. This is another AI-generated slide. Women in the bicameral, Nebraska's first 3. So this gets us to the roots of women's political engagement in elective politics in Nebraska. We've got 3 women who ran for office and won in 1924, and each of these women are really interesting and deserve to be remembered at the very least. The first one here is Sarah Muir from Lincoln. She was an English teacher at Lincoln High School, graduate of UNL, served 2 non-consecutive terms, was very involved in the Nebraska Teachers Association, ended up becoming president of the association at some point. She ran unsuccessfully for state superintendent in 1938. Her father was a medical doctor in Lincoln. Clara Humphrey was from Mullen, Hooker County, up in near the Sandhills, or in the Sandhills. And high school graduate from Broken Bow High School. She taught school, homesteaded with her husband, was a postmistress in Mullen, and her husband was an attorney, had 3 children. She's the only woman elected that had, in this time, that had children. Very involved in Republican Party politics. And then my favorite, Mabel Gillespie, from Sarpy County, from Gretna. She ran in, well, she got a lot of media attention. She served 5 terms from 1925 to 1934. And just to look at the media that she got here, she herself had been in journalism before, so she knew how to hook people in. So she was a Kearney State, I don't know if she's a graduate, but she went to Kearney State College, and she also studied law for a time at Creighton. So we have to do a little more research to see if she got any degrees out of any of those. But she's one of 6 candidates, so this is where there's more research to realize that there's a lot of women running, but not winning. And that's true in my research in California. We've got hundreds of women running for office, but not winning. And her father was a judge, county judge. And so they say, well, you know, he inspired her to run, supported her ambitions. So just some newspaper commentary about her. They all seemed to really like her. Some people claimed how good she was at remembering people's names. That caught my attention because I'm terrible at that, you know. It's like, but she would know. She claimed to know all the names of the people in her district. The Chicago newspaper picked up on that even. They also described her as being, you know, small, vibrant, low voice. You know, they gave a lot of descriptors, physical descriptions of her, which was typical of the time. Newspapers often did that. So just some highlights about her. Okay, so some of her policies. She wanted to end prohibition, but she was also for temperance, so, you know, very politically astute. She supported mother's pension. She got support from labor unions, the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen. She supported local water and power issues, and she's quoted in the newspapers saying that she was supporting a bill providing for the extension of water mains in Gretna, and she said most women want sinks in their kitchen. So that's why she was a good politician, because she could just wrap up the issue and have it resonate with her voters. So her last term was ended in 1934 when we shifted into the bicameral. She didn't run again. But she ran for the U.S. House. So she said, I have all this experience, you know, why can't I be in Congress? She also had tried to become Speaker of the legislature, of the House, when she was in the legislature. So she does not win. She's very active in the Democratic Party in the 1930s, which had a very dynamic grassroots effort. She ran for Congress in 36, 38, 1944. She went to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, was a New Dealer, and then she ran for Senate, U.S. Senate in 1954. Very engaged, obviously had ambitions, but none of them really materialized after her time in the state legislature. She ended up serving 14 years on the Public Power Board. So here we are. You didn't know it, but we're here to celebrate the centennial, 100 years, of Nebraska women's elections to office. Because these first 3 were elected in 1924, and here we are in 2024, and we've got a good history of women actively engaged in politics. More research would show that many more ran but didn't actually win, and they're involved in many aspects of the political party, but not actually elected to office themselves. So are women new to politics? My answer is no. They've been there for a long time. And I just asked some questions here. Was being first, is that a campaign strategy? Because you often find women stretching the, you know, trying to find how they're first. And first mayor of a town of this size. What is our collective memory of women in politics? Why don't we remember these women? Why aren't they part of our picture of politics in the 20th century? And does it matter that Nebraska women have run and won at all levels of national politics? And I think that's interesting about Nebraska, because we have had women at all levels of elected politics. including the governorship, which is not the case in other states. So that's my presentation here. I'd like to take questions.